It was late October of 2018, and I was on my way to a small cabin my uncle owned, deep in the woods of northern Montana. I was 31 at the time, living in Denver, and needed a break from the noise and chaos of the city. My uncle had always said I could use the cabin whenever I wanted, and this weekend seemed like the perfect opportunity. I packed light, a few changes of clothes, basic food supplies, and a good sleeping bag, since the cabin was known to get cold even with the wood stove. The drive started out fine. The main highways were well maintained, and the fall scenery was stunning. Leaves in bright reds, oranges, and yellows lined the roads, and the air had that crisp chill that hinted winter was on its way. The trip was supposed to take about 7 hours. I'd left around noon, planning to get there just before dark. The cabin was isolated, but I wasn't worried. I'd been there before, though not in a few years. The dirt road leading to it was easy to miss if you weren't paying attention, but I had GPS to guide me. About 5 hours in, I realized how few cars I'd passed since leaving the last town. It made sense, considering how remote the area was, but the emptiness was unnerving. The gas station I'd stopped at earlier had been the last sign of life for miles. The sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows across the road. I figured I'd reach the cabin with just enough daylight left to get the fire going and settle in for the night. As I turned off the main road onto the dirt path leading to the cabin, the atmosphere shifted. The trees seemed taller, the woods denser. The road was rougher than I remembered, with more potholes and loose gravel. It felt like the kind of place where time stopped. No cell service, no people, just endless trees. About 2 miles in, I noticed something that made me uneasy. Up ahead, standing on the side of the road, was a man. He was just standing there. No car nearby, no sign of why he'd be out here in the middle of nowhere. He looked to be in his 40s, wearing a dark jacket and jeans with a scruffy beard. He wasn't waving for help or doing anything to suggest he needed assistance. He was just standing there, watching my car approach. I slowed down, unsure of what to do. Every instinct told me not to stop. Something about the way he stood there so still gave me a bad feeling. As I got closer, I realized he wasn't even carrying anything. No backpack, no water bottle. Nothing to indicate he was a hiker or someone stranded. His eyes tracked my car as I passed, and for a split second, I locked eyes with him. They were dark, almost hollow, and his expression was completely blank. It wasn't anger or sadness, just emptiness. My heart was racing as I drove past him, keeping my eyes on the road ahead. I didn't look back in the rearview mirror, afraid of what I might see. After a few minutes, I started to calm down, convincing myself that maybe he was just some local or someone out for a walk. But deep down, I knew something about it wasn't right. I reached the cabin just as the last light was fading. The place was exactly as I remembered it. Small, rustic, and surrounded by trees. It had one main room with a bed, a table, and a wood stove, plus a tiny bathroom with an old composting toilet. There was no electricity, but I had lanterns and plenty of firewood stacked outside. I parked the car, grabbed my bags, and went inside, locking the door behind me. The first thing I did was start a fire. The cabin was already cold, and the warmth was a welcome comfort after the eerie encounter on the road. Once the fire was going, I unpacked my things and made a simple dinner, canned soup and some crackers. I tried to relax, telling myself that I was overreacting. People lived out here after all. Maybe that man had a cabin nearby or was just passing through. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. After dinner, I stepped outside to grab more firewood. The woods were silent, the kind of silence that presses in on you. No wind, no animals, just an oppressive stillness. I grabbed an armful of logs and turned to go back inside when I thought I saw movement between the trees. It was faint, like a shadow shifting in the corner of my eye. I froze, staring into the darkness, but there was nothing there. just trees and shadows. I went back inside and locked the door, telling myself it was my imagination. I checked my phone, but as expected, there was no service. I set it on the table and tried to distract myself by reading one of the old books my uncle kept in the cabin. The fire crackled, and the warmth made me feel a bit safer. Around midnight, I decided to call it a night. I banked the fire to keep it going and crawled into the bed, still fully dressed. The heavy blankets were a comfort, but sleep didn't come easily. Every little noise, the creak of the wood, the wind outside, made me jump. I felt like a kid again, afraid of the dark for no reason. Then, just as I was starting to drift off, I heard it, a soft crunching sound, like footsteps on the gravel outside. My heart stopped. I lay there holding my breath, listening. The footsteps were slow and deliberate, moving closer to the cabin. I wanted to believe it was an animal, but deep down I knew better. The sound stopped right outside the door. I could hear my own heartbeat, loud and frantic. Then there was a knock. Not a loud bang, but a soft, deliberate tap, tap, tap. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe. The knock came again, more insistent this time. I glanced at the door, half expecting it to burst open, but it didn't. Whoever or whatever was out there didn't try to force their way in. They just stood there, knocking. After what felt like an eternity, the knocking stopped. I lay there, every muscle tense, waiting for something to happen. Minutes passed, then an hour, and finally the silence returned. I didn't sleep that night. When dawn broke, I cautiously peeked outside. There were footprints in the gravel, leading from the trees to the door and back again. They were large, clearly made by a man. I quickly packed my things, threw them in the car, and left the cabin without looking back. As I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every shadow, every tree seemed to hide a pair of eyes. By the time I reached the main road, I felt like I could breathe again, but the image of those footprints stayed with me. I never went back to that cabin. My uncle asked me about it a few months later, wondering why I didn't visit anymore. I didn't tell him the truth. How could I? I didn't even fully understand what had happened myself. All I know is that there was a man out there, in the middle of nowhere, watching me, and he knew exactly where I was. It was a cold and rainy night in early November. The kind of night where the rain doesn't just fall. It lashes against the windows like it's trying to break in. I was staying at my sister-in-law Julia's cabin, deep in the woods of northern Maine. She had invited me up to take a break from the city. My sister-in-law was out of town for the weekend, and I'd taken her up on her offer to use the place. I figured some solitude might do me good. The cabin was a modest two-story structure, made of old, dark wood. It was surrounded by thick pine trees, the kind that made everything feel enclosed and isolated. The nearest neighbor was a good 15-minute drive away, and the narrow dirt road leading to the cabin was so muddy from the rain I almost got stuck twice. But I didn't mind. It was quiet, peaceful even. At least it was supposed to be. That night, the rain had started around sunset. By the time it was fully dark, the wind had picked up. The cabin creaked and groaned with each gust, the kind of noises you try to ignore when you're alone in a place like that. I had a fire going in the stone fireplace, the only source of warmth in the drafty cabin. Julia had warned me the heating system was unreliable, but I hadn't expected it to completely die on me. Still, the fire was enough, and I was wrapped up in a thick blanket, sipping on a cup of coffee, trying to read a book I'd found on the shelf. Around 9 p.m., I heard the first sound that didn't belong. It was faint at first, just a distant thud, like something heavy falling over outside. I froze, straining my ears against the rhythmic patter of rain. I told myself it was probably a tree branch breaking under the weight of the water, or maybe an animal knocking over something on the porch. But then I heard it again, closer this time. Another thud, followed by a dragging sound, like something being pulled through wet mud. I got up and went to the window. It was pitch black outside, the rain making it impossible to see much. The flashlight Julia had left by the door barely pierced the darkness, but I didn't see anything out of the ordinary. The porch was empty, and the yard beyond was just a blur of shadows and rain. Telling myself it was nothing, I went back to my chair and tried to focus on my book, but I couldn't shake the unease that had settled in my chest. Every creak of the cabin felt louder, every gust of wind sharper. And then, around 10 p.m., I heard it again. This time, it was unmistakable. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps on the porch. My heart started racing as I stood up and grabbed the flashlight. I turned it on and shone it toward the front door, which had a small window. For a moment, I thought I saw something move, just a shadow shifting, but the rain made it hard to tell. I turned the lock on the door, double-checking it was secure, and grabbed the fire poker from the hearth. My rational mind told me it was probably an animal, a raccoon or maybe a stray dog, but the part of me that had watched too many true crime documentaries wasn't so sure. I decided to check the back door just in case. As I made my way through the cabin, the floorboards creaked under my feet, blending with the sounds of the storm outside. The back door was locked, but I checked it anyway, tugging on the handle to make sure. Just as I was about to head back to the living room, I heard a sound that made my blood run cold. It was a knock, a soft, deliberate knock on the front door. I froze in place, my grip tightening on the fire poker. The knock came again, louder this time. Whoever or whatever it was, they weren't leaving. My mind raced. Julia hadn't mentioned anyone coming by, and I hadn't seen a car or any sign of life on my way up here. There was no reason for anyone to be out here, especially on a night like this. I moved back to the front door, keeping the flashlight trained ahead of me. The knocking stopped, but as I approached, I thought I heard something else. Breathing, faint but steady, just on the other side of the door. "Get a grip," I muttered under my breath. I was probably just imagining things. The storm and the isolation were playing tricks on me. Still, I didn't dare open the door. Instead, I turned off the flashlight and crouched by the window, peeking out into the night. The rain distorted everything, but I thought I saw a figure. A tall, dark shape standing just beyond the porch, barely visible in the gloom. I stayed like that for what felt like an eternity, my heart pounding in my chest. Eventually, the figure moved, stepping off the porch and disappearing into the trees. I waited a few more minutes, then slowly got up and locked myself in the bedroom upstairs. I felt safer up there, with a sturdy door between me and whatever was outside. I kept the fire poker by the bed and didn't even bother trying to sleep. The rain continued through the night, pounding against the roof and windows. Every so often, I thought I heard something outside, a twig snapping, a faint rustling, but I told myself it was just the wind. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving the world gray and dripping. I cautiously stepped outside to look around. The yard was a mess of mud and fallen branches, but nothing seemed out of place. At first, then I saw them. Footprints. Deep, muddy footprints leading from the porch into the woods. They were large, too large to be mine, and spaced far apart, like whoever made them had been running. I followed them to the edge of the trees, but then they disappeared, swallowed by the forest. I thought about calling Julia, but what would I say? That I'd gotten spooked by some noises in the night? She'd laugh it off, tell me it was probably a deer or a bear, but I knew better. I packed up and left that afternoon, cutting my trip short. I didn't tell Julia what happened, and I haven't been back to the cabin since. But sometimes on quiet nights, I think about those footsteps and wonder if whoever or whatever was out there that night is still in those woods, waiting. I decided to rent a cabin deep in the woods for a week to get away from the noise of the city. Life had been stressful. Work, bills, the constant hum of traffic outside my apartment. A week of quiet sounded like exactly what I needed. The cabin was small but cozy, tucked away in a remote part of the Adirondacks. It was the kind of place you'd imagine in a postcard, with a wood-burning stove, large windows overlooking the trees, and no neighbors for miles. It was mid-November, and the forest was bare, the trees stripped of their leaves. The air was crisp, and the first hints of winter were creeping in. I arrived early in the afternoon, the sun casting long shadows across the gravel driveway. I unloaded my car, carrying in groceries, a stack of books, and a few essentials. The cabin had no internet or cell service, just a landline for emergencies, which added to its charm. I liked the idea of disconnecting for a while. The first day was uneventful. I lit a fire, cooked a simple dinner, and sat by the window, watching the trees sway in the wind. The quiet was almost unsettling at first, but I quickly grew to appreciate it. The next day, I spent hours hiking the nearby trails, taking in the rugged beauty of the forest. By the time I returned to the cabin, the sun was dipping below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. It was the third night when things started to feel off. I was sitting in the living room, reading a book by the fire, when I thought I heard something outside. At first, I brushed it off as an animal, a raccoon or maybe a deer. But then I heard it again, a soft crunch of gravel, as though someone was walking near the cabin. I froze, listening intently. The sound stopped. Trying to shake off my unease, I checked the windows but saw nothing unusual. The forest was dark, the trees casting eerie shadows under the moonlight. I locked the doors, double-checked the windows, and went to bed, convincing myself I was just being paranoid. The next morning, I found footprints in the dirt outside the cabin. They weren't mine. They were fresh, too, leading from the driveway around to the back of the cabin. My stomach sank as I followed the trail. Whoever had been here had walked up to the back door and then stopped. The prints didn't lead away. It was as if they had vanished. I spent the day trying to focus on anything but the footprints, but the thought of someone being near the cabin unnerved me. I kept telling myself it was probably a hiker who had gotten lost or a hunter passing through. But as the sun set and the forest grew dark, my nerves started to get the better of me. That night, I made sure every door and window was locked. I left the lights on and kept a kitchen knife within reach. I told myself I was overreacting, but the silence of the cabin felt oppressive, as if it was holding its breath. Around midnight, I woke up to a noise, a faint creak, like a floorboard shifting under weight. My heart pounded as I lay in bed, straining to hear. The sound came again, closer this time. It wasn't coming from outside. It was inside the cabin. I grabbed the knife and crept out of bed, my hands shaking. The cabin was dark, the fire reduced to glowing embers in the hearth. As I moved toward the living room, I saw a shadow move. My blood ran cold. There, standing near the window, was a man. He was dirty, his clothes torn, and his face gaunt. His eyes darted around the room like a trapped animal. I froze, my mind racing. He hadn't seen me yet, and I didn't want to make a sound. Slowly, I backed away toward the bedroom, my heart hammering in my chest. I locked the door and pushed the dresser against it, trying to steady my breathing. I didn't know how long I sat there, gripping the knife and listening to the sounds of the cabin. I could hear him moving around, opening drawers, rummaging through my things. At one point, I thought I heard him trying the bedroom door, but the dresser held firm. Time dragged on, each second feeling like an eternity. I was terrified he would break the door down or find another way in. Eventually, the noises stopped. I sat in silence, straining to hear anything. The only sound was the wind rattling the windows. After what felt like hours, I cautiously moved the dresser and opened the door a crack. The cabin was empty. He was gone. The rest of the night, I couldn't sleep. I stayed by the window watching the driveway, knife still in hand. When the first light of dawn broke, I called the local sheriff's office on the landline. They said they'd send someone out immediately. When the deputies arrived, I felt a wave of relief. They searched the property and found signs that someone had been living in an old, abandoned shed a short distance from the cabin. Inside, they discovered a makeshift bed, empty food cans, and even some of my belongings. It looked like he had been there for days, watching me. The deputies assured me they'd patrol the area and keep an eye out for him. They suggested I leave the cabin, and I didn't argue. I packed up my things and left that morning, my nerves still on edge. A week later, I received a call from the sheriff's office. They had caught the man a few miles from the cabin. He had a history of breaking into remote homes and had recently escaped from a nearby prison. The thought of how close he had been and what could have happened still haunts me. I never went back to that cabin. What started as a peaceful retreat had turned into a nightmare. Even now, years later, I still feel uneasy in the woods. That week changed the way I see isolation. Sometimes the quiet isn't peaceful. It's a warning. I always thought of myself as someone who enjoyed isolation. After working in the city for years, I'd saved enough to buy a small cabin in the middle of nowhere. It wasn't fancy, just one large room with a kitchenette, a small bathroom, and a loft where I'd put my bed. The cabin sat at the edge of a dense forest in northern Minnesota. The nearest town was nearly 20 miles away, and my closest neighbor was a retired man who lived 3 miles down the gravel road. It was perfect. I bought the cabin in early spring of 2022. I planned to spend the summer fixing it up and enjoying the quiet before deciding if I wanted to live there permanently. I was 32 at the time, single, and used to being alone. I figured this would be a good chance to disconnect, breathe some fresh air, and maybe reset my life a bit. But now, looking back, I wonder if I should have just stayed in the city. The first month was peaceful. The mornings were crisp and quiet, the afternoons warm and sunny. I spent my days patching up small leaks in the roof, replacing broken windows, and clearing out decades of junk left by the previous owner. By the end of May, I transformed the place into a cozy retreat. I had my little routines: drinking coffee on the porch in the mornings, hiking through the woods in the afternoons, and reading by lantern light at night. The cabin didn't have electricity, but I didn't mind. I liked the simplicity of it. One evening in late June, I decided to take a longer hike than usual. There was an old logging trail that started near the back of my property and wound deep into the forest. I'd been meaning to explore it for weeks, but always put it off. That day, the weather was perfect. Clear skies, just warm enough to make the hike pleasant. So I grabbed a bottle of water, my flashlight, and my pocket knife and set off. The trail was overgrown but still visible. It twisted and turned through the trees, sometimes narrowing to little more than a deer path. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, and the only sounds were the rustling leaves and the occasional chirp of a bird. I felt completely alone, and I liked it. About an hour into the hike, I noticed something strange. The trail suddenly veered left, away from the direction I thought it was heading. It wasn't a sharp turn, more like a slow curve, but it was enough to make me pause. The trees were denser here, and the light filtering through the canopy had a strange, greenish tint. I checked my watch. It was nearly 6 p.m. I had about an hour of daylight left, maybe a little more. I decided to keep going, figuring I could turn back if the trail didn't loop around soon. The curve in the trail led me to a small clearing. In the middle of the clearing was a rusted pickup truck, its tires flat and its windows smashed. The truck was old, probably from the 1970s, and completely overgrown with vines and moss. It looked like it had been there for decades. I walked around it curious, but didn't touch it. Something about the way it sat there, abandoned and silent, made me uneasy. That's when I noticed the footprints. They were faint but fresh, indentations in the soft dirt leading away from the truck and into the woods. I crouched down to look closer. They were boot prints, and from the size, I guessed they belonged to a man. There were no other tracks nearby, no animal prints, no tire marks, nothing. Just the single set of boot prints leading deeper into the forest. I stood up and looked around. The clearing was quiet, too quiet. The usual sounds of the woods, birdsong, the rustle of leaves were gone. It was as if the forest was holding its breath. A shiver ran down my spine, but I told myself I was just being paranoid. The prints could have been from a hunter or a hiker, maybe even someone like me exploring the trail. Still, I decided it was time to head back. I retraced my steps quickly, glancing over my shoulder more often than I care to admit. By the time I made it back to the cabin, the sun was dipping below the horizon, and the shadows were long and dark. I locked the door behind me and lit the lantern, trying to shake off the unease that clung to me. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind, made my heart race. I kept picturing those boot prints, imagining some stranger wandering through the woods, maybe watching me from the trees. By the time dawn broke, I was exhausted but relieved to see the sunlight streaming through the windows. The next few days were uneventful. I tried to convince myself that the boot prints didn't mean anything, that I was overreacting. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I started noticing little things. A broken branch near the edge of the clearing, the faint sound of twigs snapping at night. Once, while chopping wood, I thought I saw movement in the trees out of the corner of my eye, but when I turned, there was nothing there. Then one night, I woke up to a sound that made my blood run cold. It was faint at first, almost indistinguishable from the creaks and groans of the cabin. But as I lay there, holding my breath, I realized it was the sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps circling the cabin. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The footsteps were heavy, like someone wearing boots. They moved around the cabin, stopping occasionally, then starting again. I reached for my flashlight and knife, clutching them tightly. The lantern on the table cast flickering shadows across the walls, making the cabin feel smaller, more vulnerable. The footsteps stopped at the front door. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. For what felt like an eternity, there was silence. Then, slowly, the footsteps retreated, growing fainter until they disappeared into the woods. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. When the sun finally rose, I stepped outside cautiously, scanning the area. The ground around the cabin was soft from recent rain, and sure enough, there were boot prints. They circled the cabin, just as I'd heard, then disappeared into the forest. I spent the rest of the day trying to decide what to do. Part of me wanted to pack up and leave, but another part of me didn't want to be driven out by fear. I told myself it could have been a prank or maybe a lost hiker, but deep down I knew it wasn't. Over the next week, things escalated. I found more footprints around the cabin, always in the mornings, always fresh. I started hearing noises at night, branches snapping, faint rustling, the occasional thud against the walls of the cabin. One morning, I found a pile of rocks stacked neatly on the porch. Another day, I found the latch on the shed had been broken. I stopped going on hikes. I kept the lantern burning all night and slept with my knife under my pillow. But no matter what I did, the feeling of being watched never went away. The woods, once peaceful and inviting, now felt suffocating and hostile. I couldn't shake the sense that whoever or whatever was out there was getting bolder. The final straw came one night in mid-July. I woke up to the sound of heavy breathing. It was faint but unmistakable, coming from just outside the window by the loft. I stayed still, my heart racing, listening as the breathing grew louder, more deliberate. Then came the sound of something scratching at the wood, slow and deliberate, as if testing the walls. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my flashlight, knife, and the small hatchet I kept by the door and ran outside, shouting into the night. The flashlight's beam cut through the darkness, but there was nothing there. The woods were silent, the air heavy with tension. I stood there for a long time, scanning the trees, before retreating back inside and locking the door. That was the last night I spent in the cabin. I left the next morning, throwing everything I could into my truck and driving away without looking back. I never found out who or what had been out there. Maybe it was just some stranger messing with me, or maybe it was something worse. All I know is that I've never felt that kind of fear again, and I never want to. The cabin still stands, as far as I know. Sometimes, late at night, I think about those footprints, the breathing, the scratches on the walls, and I wonder if whoever or whatever was out there is still waiting. I had always known my grandmother's farm cabin in France as a quiet, unassuming place, nestled deep in the countryside where life moved slowly and the air always smelled of damp earth and wildflowers. She had owned it since the 1950s, a sturdy stone structure with wooden beams and a roof that sagged in places but still held strong against the elements. As a child, I spent summers there, chasing chickens and exploring the thick woods surrounding the property. But as I got older, my visits became less frequent. Life pulled me in other directions, and soon, the farm became nothing more than a distant memory. It wasn't until 2018, after Grandma's passing, that I returned to the cabin. She had left it to me in her will, along with the few acres of land it sat on. I was 32 at the time, recently divorced, and looking for an escape from the chaos of city life. The idea of spending a few weeks alone in the quiet countryside appealed to me. I figured I could sort through her belongings, make some repairs, and decide what to do with the place. When I arrived, the cabin looked much the same as I remembered it. The stone walls were weathered but solid, and the wooden shutters hung slightly askew. The garden, once meticulously tended by my grandmother, was overgrown with weeds and wildflowers. The barn, a small structure to the left of the cabin, leaned precariously, its roof caved in on one side. Despite its state of disrepair, the place felt familiar, almost comforting. I spent the first few days cleaning and organizing. The interior was cluttered with old furniture, faded photographs, and stacks of yellowed newspapers. I found myself lost in memories as I sifted through her things, each item a reminder of my childhood summers. But the more time I spent there, the more I noticed things that seemed off. It started with small noises. At first, I chalked them up to the house settling or the wind rattling the shutters. But then I began hearing distinct sounds. The creak of floorboards upstairs, the faint tap of something against the window at night, the rustle of movement in the barn. I tried to ignore it, convincing myself that it was nothing more than animals or my imagination. One afternoon, while clearing out the barn, I found something strange. Tucked away in a dusty corner was a trapdoor I had never noticed before. The wooden planks were old and splintered, and a rusted metal ring served as a handle. It was partially hidden beneath a pile of rotting hay, which explained why I hadn't seen it as a child. Curiosity got the better of me, and I heaved it open. Beneath the trapdoor was a narrow staircase leading into darkness. The air that wafted up was cold and damp, carrying the faint smell of mold and earth. I hesitated for a moment, my flashlight in hand, before descending the steps. The stone walls were rough and cool to the touch, and the stairs creaked under my weight. At the bottom, I found a small, dirt-floored cellar. It was empty except for a wooden table pushed against one wall and a single chair lying on its side. The table was covered in strange markings, carved deep into the wood, and what looked like dried candle wax. I couldn't make sense of the symbols, but they gave me an uneasy feeling. I decided not to linger and quickly made my way back up. That night, I couldn't shake the image of the cellar from my mind. The markings on the table, the oppressive silence of the space. It all felt wrong. I locked the trapdoor before heading inside, but sleep didn't come easily. Every sound seemed amplified in the stillness of the night. The creak of the old beams, the whisper of wind through the trees, the faint scuffle of movement outside. It all set my nerves on edge. The next morning, I noticed something unusual. The trapdoor in the barn was slightly ajar. I was certain I had closed it the day before, even placing a heavy brick on top to keep it secure. Unease settled over me as I stared at the open hatch. If it wasn't animals, then someone else had been here. Determined to get to the bottom of it, I decided to install a small motion-activated camera I had brought with me. It was meant for monitoring wildlife, but it would do the job. I set it up in the barn, pointed directly at the trapdoor, and waited. For the rest of the day, I tried to distract myself with chores. I fixed the shutters, cleared out more of the clutter inside the cabin, and even ventured into the woods to collect firewood. But the feeling of being watched never left me. It was subtle, like the weight of unseen eyes pressing against my back. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see someone or something standing there, but there was never anything. That night, I retrieved the camera and reviewed the footage. At first, everything seemed normal. The barn was still and quiet, the trapdoor undisturbed. But then, around 2 a.m., the footage showed something that made my blood run cold. The trapdoor creaked open, slowly, as if pushed from below. A figure emerged. A man, thin and stooped, with long, unkempt hair and clothes that hung off his frame like rags. He moved with a strange, jerky gait, like a puppet on strings, and disappeared into the shadows of the barn. I replayed the footage several times, my hands trembling. Who was he? How long had he been hiding beneath the cabin? And why? I spent the next few hours barricading the cabin. I nailed the windows shut, pushed furniture against the doors, and kept a heavy wrench by my side. Sleep was out of the question. I sat in the living room, flashlight in hand, listening for any sound of movement outside. The hours dragged on, and the night seemed endless. Around 4 a.m., I heard it, the faint scrape of something against the front door. My heart pounded as I stared at the door, the wrench gripped tightly in my hand. The sound stopped, only to start again at the window. Whoever or whatever it was, they were testing the barriers. When dawn finally broke, I didn't waste any time. I packed my things, loaded them into the car, and drove away without looking back. The cabin could rot for all I cared. I couldn't stay there, not after what I had seen. I contacted the local authorities once I was back in the city, but they found no sign of anyone in the barn or the cellar. To this day, I can't explain what happened at my grandmother's cabin. I don't know who the man was or what he was doing there. All I know is that I'll never go back. Some places are better left forgotten, their secrets buried in the past. And that cabin, with its creaking floorboards and dark cellar, is one of them. It was mid-October when I decided to rent a cabin for the weekend. I needed a break from the city, the constant noise, the flashing lights, the stress. I was 34, working a finance job that had started to feel like it was eating away at me. I didn't need much, just some time alone in nature, away from screens and the endless cycle of emails. So, I booked a small cabin in the middle of Vermont, deep in the woods. The pictures online showed a cozy little place with a fireplace, a front porch, and nothing but trees for miles around. It seemed perfect. I arrived late Friday afternoon, just as the sun was setting. The drive had been long, winding through roads that got narrower and rougher the farther I went. By the time I reached the cabin, I hadn't seen another car for over an hour. The place was as quiet as I'd hoped. No neighbors, no noise, just the sound of leaves rustling in the breeze. I parked my car on the gravel driveway, grabbed my bags, and stepped inside. The cabin was small but comfortable. A single-story building with a living room, a tiny kitchen, a bathroom, and one bedroom. There was a wood-burning stove in the corner, a couch that looked like it had seen better days, and a dining table with 2 chairs. Everything smelled faintly of wood and pine, with a slight dampness that reminded me I was far from modern amenities. But I didn't mind. It felt like the solitude I'd been craving. After unpacking, I decided to explore the property a bit. The cabin sat on about 10 acres of land, surrounded by dense forest. There was a narrow trail leading into the woods, and I followed it for a while, breathing in the crisp autumn air. The trees were a riot of colors, reds, yellows, and oranges, and the ground was covered in fallen leaves. It was beautiful, but as the light began to fade, I felt a subtle unease creep in. The shadows between the trees grew darker, and every little sound, the crunch of leaves, the snap of a twig, seemed amplified. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. After all, I wasn't used to being so isolated. I headed back to the cabin, started a fire in the stove, and cooked a simple dinner. I had brought some books with me, planning to spend the evening reading by the fire. But as the hours passed, I found myself distracted. I kept glancing out the window, peering into the darkness beyond the porch. There was nothing out there, just trees and shadows, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I chalked it up to nerves and tried to focus on my book. When I finally went to bed, I locked all the doors and windows, something I didn't normally do back in the city. The cabin felt too open, too exposed. The bedroom window faced the woods, and as I lay in bed, I couldn't help but stare at it. The glass reflected the faint glow of the moon, and beyond that was nothing but darkness. I pulled the curtains shut and forced myself to sleep. I woke up in the middle of the night to a sound outside. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but as I lay there, I realized it was something else. It was a faint, rhythmic tapping, like someone or something was knocking on the wooden porch. My heart started to race. I told myself it was probably just a branch or an animal. This was the woods, after all. But the sound continued, steady and deliberate. I got up quietly and grabbed the flashlight I had left on the bedside table. My pulse was pounding in my ears as I crept to the living room, avoiding the windows. The tapping stopped just as I reached the door. I stood there, listening, every muscle in my body tense. The only sound was the crackling of the dying fire in the stove. After a few minutes, I convinced myself it was nothing and went back to bed. The next morning, I checked the porch. There was nothing unusual, no fallen branches, no signs of animals. But I noticed something odd. The doormat, which had been right in front of the door, was now off to the side, as if it had been moved. It wasn't much, but it unsettled me. I tried to shake it off and went about my day. I spent Saturday hiking around the property, trying to enjoy the scenery, but the feeling of unease from the night before lingered. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone following me. I didn't, of course, but the woods felt different, less inviting, more oppressive. I cut my hike short and went back to the cabin. That night, the tapping came again. It started just after midnight, the same slow, deliberate rhythm. This time, it was louder, more insistent. I sat up in bed, clutching the flashlight, my heart racing. I wanted to believe it was an animal, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. It sounded too deliberate, too human. I didn't sleep much after that. The tapping stopped after a while, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was out there. I stayed in bed, listening to every creak and rustle, until the first light of dawn. Sunday morning, I decided to leave early. The weekend was supposed to be relaxing, but it had turned into something else entirely. I packed up my things quickly, eager to get back to the safety of the city. As I loaded my bags into the car, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. Footprints in the dirt driveway. They were faint but unmistakable, large, heavy prints leading from the woods to the cabin and back again. My hands shook as I stared at them. I got in the car and started the engine, my only thought being to get out of there as fast as possible. As I pulled out of the driveway, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw something that made my blood run cold. Standing at the edge of the woods, half hidden by the trees, was a figure. It was tall and motionless, its features obscured by the shadows. I couldn't tell if it was a person or something else, but it was watching me. I didn't wait to find out. I hit the gas and drove away, my heart pounding in my chest. The drive back to the city was a blur. I couldn't stop thinking about the figure in the woods, the footprints, the tapping. I don't know who or what it was, and I don't want to know. All I know is that I won't be going back to that cabin or any cabin ever again. Sometimes, when I'm alone in my apartment at night, I think I hear that same tapping sound, faint and rhythmic. I tell myself it's just my imagination, but deep down, I'm not so sure. Whatever was out there in the woods, I don't think it's done with me yet. I was 29 when I found myself alone in a small, secluded cabin in the backwoods of South Carolina. I'd rented it on a whim after seeing a listing online. The description promised a peaceful getaway, far from the distractions of city life, and I needed the break. Work had been overwhelming, and my life in Charleston had become an endless loop of emails, deadlines, and late nights. A week in the middle of nowhere sounded like just the reset I needed. The cabin sat deep in the woods, about 40 miles from the nearest small town. It was a simple one-bedroom structure, nothing fancy, just enough to sleep, cook, and sit on the porch while listening to the sounds of nature. The owner had warned me in the listing that cell service was spotty and the nearest neighbor was about 2 miles away. That suited me just fine. I was craving solitude. I arrived on a Monday afternoon in mid-November. The drive to the cabin was picturesque, the paved roads eventually giving way to a dirt trail that twisted through thick trees. By the time I pulled up to the cabin, the sun was already low in the sky, casting long shadows over the clearing. The cabin looked just like the pictures. Small, rustic, with a tin roof and a wraparound porch. There was a stack of firewood next to the door, and a narrow gravel path led to a fire pit a few yards away. Beyond the clearing, the forest stretched endlessly in all directions, a wall of towering pine trees and tangled underbrush. I unpacked quickly, carrying my bags inside and setting up for the week. The interior was cozy but sparse, a wood-burning stove, a small kitchen with an old gas range, and a single bedroom with a lumpy-looking bed. A few oil lamps sat on shelves, along with a stack of dusty books and a lantern. As night fell, I lit a fire in the stove and cooked a simple dinner. The silence outside was complete, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant hoot of an owl. I felt a sense of peace I hadn't experienced in months. The first 2 days passed uneventfully. I spent my mornings hiking the trails around the property, following them deeper into the woods until they disappeared into the undergrowth. Afternoons were for reading on the porch or sitting by the fire. It was exactly what I'd hoped for: quiet, peaceful, and restorative. But on the third night, something changed. I was sitting by the fire pit, the flames crackling softly as I sipped a cup of coffee. The night was darker than usual, with heavy clouds obscuring the moon. The forest around me felt closer, the trees looming like silent sentinels. It was then that I heard it, a sound that didn't belong. At first, it was faint, almost drowned out by the crackling fire. A soft crunch of leaves, the snap of a twig. I froze, straining to hear over the pounding of my heart. The sound came again, closer this time. A deliberate step in the underbrush, slow and measured. I turned toward the noise, peering into the darkness beyond the firelight. My first thought was an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, but the steps were too heavy, too deliberate. They didn't shuffle or scurry like an animal would. I grabbed the flashlight I'd left on the ground beside me and shone it into the trees. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the trunks of trees and tangled bushes, but there was nothing there. For a long moment, I sat frozen, listening. The forest was silent again, as if holding its breath. I told myself it was nothing, just my imagination, and eventually forced myself to go back inside. But that night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The next day, I decided to explore a new trail I'd found earlier in the week. It wasn't marked, just a narrow path cutting through the undergrowth, but I was curious where it led. I packed a small bag with water and snacks and set out mid-morning. The trail wound deeper into the woods, the trees growing denser as I walked. The air felt cooler here, the sunlight barely penetrating the thick canopy overhead. I followed the trail for what felt like an hour, the silence pressing in around me. Then I found it. The trail ended abruptly in a small clearing, where an old, weathered shed stood. It looked like it had been abandoned for years, the wood gray with age and the roof sagging in the middle. Something about it made me uneasy. I walked closer, my boots crunching on the dry leaves. The door was slightly ajar, hanging crookedly on its hinges. I hesitated, debating whether to look inside. Part of me wanted to turn around and leave, but curiosity got the better of me. Inside, the shed was empty except for a few rusted tools and an old wooden chair. The air smelled damp and musty, and the floor was covered in a thin layer of dirt. As I turned to leave, something caught my eye. Scratches on the back wall, long and deep, as if someone had dragged a blade across the wood. I left the shed quickly, a sense of unease settling over me. The walk back to the cabin felt longer, the forest quieter than before. That night, the noises returned. This time, they were closer, circling the cabin. I sat by the window, staring into the darkness, clutching the old hunting knife I'd found in one of the kitchen drawers. The sounds came and went, footsteps, the crack of branches, a faint rustling just beyond the edge of the clearing. I didn't sleep. By morning, I'd made up my mind to leave. The peace I'd found earlier in the week was gone, replaced by a gnawing sense of dread. I packed my things quickly, throwing everything into the back of my car. As I started the engine, I glanced back at the cabin one last time. That's when I saw it. Something standing at the edge of the woods, half hidden in the shadows. It was a man, or at least it looked like one, tall and thin, wearing dark clothes. He didn't move, didn't make a sound, just stood there watching me. I didn't wait to see what he'd do. I floored the gas pedal, the tires kicking up gravel as I sped down the dirt road. My hands were shaking, my heart racing, but I didn't stop until I was miles away, back on the main highway. I never went back to that cabin. Months later, I tried to find the listing online, but it had disappeared, as if it had never existed. Sometimes, late at night, I think about that figure in the woods and the scratches on the shed wall. I wonder if I'd stayed longer, would I have found out who or what was out there? Or would they have found me first? I'll never know, but I don't think I want to.